Hey, what's going on? I'm Michael Nelson. I am currently enrolled in teaching the Bible creatively. It's a summer course. It's a great course. We have two presentations. The first presentation we had to do was we had to choose a method, and the method I think I chose was the theological method. Um, for this particular assignment, we had to choose another method to make a presentation. And the one that I really felt, that spoke to my heart was the psychological method. Um, the psychological method, it basically has to deal with, the study of the mind, what really is going on in the scriptures, what really psychologically, is happening, whether it's be hereditary things, the environment that's affecting the person's actions. Um, it could be a range of feelings, emotions, all these different things that make up the psychological aspect. And that's what I'm going to attempt to do. Um, the book that I got is Jonah. So, Jonah, it's a short book. It's really not much to explain. But I believe that even though it's a short book, that we still can look at this from a psychological standpoint. So, with beginning, from the psychological method, I'm going to try to explain how his environment and hereditary things, how it affected Jonah and how it affected his thinking. Now, one key thing that I want to go over and I want to explain is that in the book of Jonah, we really don't see too much of his family or his friends or those who are in his family as you might have with other biblical characters. Um, you got Jesus and his whole family line, But with Jonah, he really doesn't have too much family that we can see in the scriptures. But I found something significant. I found something that may have caused the way he acted, and that's his environment. Now, you got to understand where Jonah is from, and we have to understand, his environment that he's used to having. Now, Jonah is from, as we see in the scriptures, as I did some careful background research, that Jonah is actually from Israel. Now, we all know, the history and the story behind Israel. We all know what type of people were in Israel. In Israel, we had people who would, follow directions, people who wouldn't follow directions. Um, Israel was meant originally to be, a blessing to all the other nations, but somehow it got screwed up. The people became immoral. They were doing immoral things. They were openly defying God, and they were just doing things that God was not pleased with. Now, we can learn a lot of things from this, but we'll talk about that a little later. So, we see that in Jonah, in the beginning of the book, that God calls him to Nineveh. Now, Nineveh is some miles away from, Israel. It's kind of a far place. I think in my careful research, it's about 500 miles or something like that. Now we see that Jonah, who is from Israel, and we already identified that Israel was a society who was openly defiant against God, and we see that that's what was going on. So God called him to Nineveh, and then we see what happens when God calls him to Nineveh. We see something that we all do at some times in our life. We decide to run from God, and Jonah. Now we see Jonah is on the run from God. God called him to Nineveh. He had a specific task at hand for him, and he just did not want to do it for whatever reason. We'll get into that a little later. But he just did not want to do it. So we see that his environment and the people that he was around, I can bet that this directly influenced Jonah. As we describe, the people of Israel, they were openly defiant. God would give them a set of directions. They would openly defy it sometimes. Sometimes they would take precaution. So we see that that's what's going on. So we can see that Jonah, this is where he's getting this from. He's getting this from his environment. I mean, after all, if you see people in leadership, because we see kings throughout Israel who were openly defiant against God, who were disobedient, God would tell them to do certain things and they just wouldn't do it. So if you're around corrupt leadership and leadership that isn't strong and they're causing, all these type of problems and they're openly defiant, we can see that that can spread throughout, not just, the people, but that can spread throughout widespread generations. And I believe that this is where Jonah got kind of this, defiant attitude where he really didn't want to follow God's directions. So, and continue to read, another thing that I want to emphasize on is when we deal with this psychological method, we also have to take into account different feelings and different emotions that are going on. So, not only do we look at this through a psychological aspect and we look at it through an environmental standpoint of things that are going on, but we attempt to look at through feelings and also emotions, because that plays a big part in our psychological thinking and what we do and what we determine. So um, we're going to look at that through our feelings and our emotions. Um, we see in the book of Jonah that a variety of different things are going on from a psychological standpoint. Um, from the beginning of the book, I would say one of the things that Jonah has, one of the emotions that Jonah has, he has is this fear. He has fear, that God called him to do something, and Jonah didn't want to really do it for whatever reason. But more importantly, the second thing that we can identify is not only is he may be afraid, but we see also that he's angry. If you look, you do your history and your background, we know that the people of Nineveh, and the capital of Nineveh is Assyria. We see Assyria and the people from Israel. They really didn't like each other, and the reason that they always had this constant conflict or battle is because the um, the Israelites, they would see Assyria as a threat to them because of their size, because of the reputation of the city. It was very, they were doing different things. It was like twice as immoral than Israel. So they saw this city as a great threat. So we see Jonah is probably angry and upset and saying, God, why would you call me to do this? You know for a fact that me being an Israelite and those people being the Syrians, that we really don't get along. So that we see that that's what happens. So continue to reading. The next emotion that I want to talk about and that we see that Jonah is again, he's probably afraid. We're going to continue with being afraid because not only does when this story is going on, he comes to sailors, and the sailors, the storm is going on, and Jonah's on the run from God, so he gets on his boat with sailors, and we see that, that the sailors are not doing anything wrong, and Jonah gets on the boat, and a storm arises. And what happens when a storm arises, the sailors want to figure out what caused the storm, because I'm assuming that before that, it probably was sunny outside, it was a nice breezy day. Um, so they cast lots, and the lot falls on Jonah. And now the people want to know, well, why did you do this? And Jonah says, it's my fault. So Jonah owns up, and he gets thrown into the water. As he gets thrown into the water, he gets eaten by a whale. Now, I'm pretty sure if any of us, a whale or fish, it's a debate. If any of us was to get swallowed by a whale or a fish, I'm pretty sure that we would be, afraid. So we have, this emotion of fear and anger and asking God, why did you call me to do this? And now I'm stuck in, a fish or a giant whale, however you want to explain it. And Jonah is probably afraid. Um, we see while he's in there for 3 nights, he writes a prayer to God, asking God to release him, and his faith actually works for him. And we see Jonah has all these different type of emotions throughout the book. Make a long story short, the whale spits him out, and he's able to go and fulfill his task, and that was preached to the people at Nineveh, and the people got saved. To make a long story short, so we see that from his feelings and his emotions, he was angry. He probably was reluctant that at first he didn't fulfill what God wanted him to do, and he wasted time, and he was fearful. He was fearful. He got thrown into the water. He got swallowed by a whale. So we see he has all these different emotions, and we must, from a psychological standpoint, we must, when we get ourselves backed up in the corner, we must always be thinking, with our mind straight, because if we don't, we can make choices based off of how we feel and not off what God is saying. So that's another key thing that we always have to realize. If I was planning to teach this to a class, I would just say, what? We just got to always be aware, that God wants us to think, logically and not just think off of our emotions. I will plan to teach this probably to a Bible study. Thank you. It's been real. See you later.